Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Kat Robison. I'm a lecturer in American Studies at the United States Studies Center. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. The United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney is an independent research institute dedicated to rigorous analysis of American foreign policy, economics, technology, politics, and culture. Its mission is to deepen Australia's understanding of the United States and to provide insights that inform the Australian-US alliance. As part of our work, we often bring senior US experts to Australia. These visits provide Australian audiences with direct insights into current US policy thinking and strategic priorities. At the same time, they enrich the national debates by offering informed perspectives on the shared challenges and opportunities facing both countries. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us Ms. Audrey Schaefer. Ms. Audrey. Audrey is an internationally recognized expert in space policy who currently serves as the Vice President of Strategy and Policy at Slingshot Aerospace and a non-resident senior associate with the Aerospace Security Project at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Also with me, we have some Australian experts. So next to me is Professor Melissa Deswart, who is a professor of space law and governance at the University of Adelaide. She is a preeminent expert in Australian space law. She's also the Deputy Director and Chief Investigator of the ARC Center of Excellence in Plants for Space, and as I said, a Professor of Space Law and Governance at the Andy Thomas Center for Space Resources. And then we also have Aude Vignelles. She is the Director of Vignelles Space and previously served as the inaugural Chief Technology Officer of the Australian Space Agency, where she was core contributor in development of the technical roadmaps of the Australian Civil Space Strategy. So if you'll all join me in welcoming our experts tonight. So what I've asked our panelists here is just to begin with an opening round, just an introduction so you have an idea of who they are. After that, we'll have a few questions and then we will open it up to audience Q&A. So I encourage you as you hear them speak to think of questions you might like to ask, and we'd love to have you be participants in this conversation. So Audrey, I think I might start with you. Just give us a little intro.
Of course. Thanks, Kat. And thank you all for being here tonight. It's really lovely to have the opportunity to share some perspectives on space and space security. I suppose I'm the resident senior US expert on space policy here tonight. And as Kat alluded to in my biography, I have been working on space policy for almost 20 years now in the United States. I spent most of that time actually working in the US government, where I held positions in our Defense Department as well as at our White House, coordinating all aspects of national security space policy. And, you know, look, I have always been interested in space ever since I was a little girl. I wanted to work in the space industry. But when I was a kid, you know, I was more interested in the space exploration side, you know, the NASA side, sending humans, you know, to the moon, Mars, and beyond. But the more I got involved in space security with the work that I did in defense, the more I realized the importance of space to all all aspects of our lives. So, you know, we all use space on a daily basis, probably in ways that most of us don't even recognize, whether it's the GPS that you use to navigate to get here, the communication satellites that carry long-haul communications, the television that we receive, you know, in far-flung areas that comes to us from satellites. We are all beneficiaries of space. We also don't always appreciate, you know, the ways in which space is woven into the fabric of our economies either, whether that's the timing signal that powers a lot of financial transactions. We talked in an earlier event today about all the logistics, oil, gas, transportation that uses space capabilities. And then finally, I mean, the subject tonight really on the security side, you know, space is integral to modern militaries, as in particular in the US. Our entire force structure is really built on the assumption that space capabilities will be there when they need them, whether that's for the same types of applications like long-range communications or precision navigation, or even early warning of strategic missile threats. Our military is built on that foundation of a space capability. And so I know we're going to talk today about the importance of space security. And I think, you know, obviously it's the importance of keeping these satellites safe is not for the satellites themselves. It's for all the things that they do for those of us on Earth, that it's so important to make sure that we protect them.
Thank you, Audrey. Melissa.
Thanks, Kat. So I am a space lawyer, and that always provokes a bit of shock and surprise, even this afternoon when I said it. So I'm glad to see it's still fresh. My background is very much in technology law. So I used to head up the legal department at CSIRO. So I very much learned early on as a lawyer that lawyers are much less important than engineers and scientists. And that's sort of been a very good place for me to sit for the rest of my professional life. But I got interested in space law through my involvement in internet law and the way in which the regulation actually shapes and guides the technology. So the internet would not be the way it is right now, for good or for bad, if it were not for regulatory decisions that were made by the US government in the 90s. So you can see there's lots of similarities with the space environment. We know that the environment is very much shaped by law, but also by our strategic partnerships. So my work encompasses very much the human uses of outer space. So I look at commercial and military uses of outer space, but I'm particularly passionate about the promise or the capability of space as such a big, difficult, complex project for us to tackle, that it could bring us together in multidisciplinary, but also multinational teams working on projects like the moon and beyond to Mars. And I hope we get to talk a bit tonight about where are we going. But yeah, I also was a space nerd as a kid, and I rewatch movies. Like I was rewatching like Apollo 13 on the plane a few weeks ago, and I was still crying, right? Even really cheesy films like Fly Me to the Moon still make me cry. So I am a space nerd through and through, and I'm still an optimist about why it's so important for us to go there and what we can learn when we're there.
Thank you, Melissa. Aude?
Thank you. I'm also a space nerd, so I'm a space system engineer or a rocket scientist, as you say here. I didn't know that expression before arriving to Australia. It's not rocket science, otherwise everybody's pulling my legs, but it's actually an expression. So I studied space system engineering because I love space tech. I'm very curious about how things work, and I was lucky enough to watch the launch of the first Ariane rocket in 1979. And when you see that, you are hooked for life and you want to work in space. But also the international community that is working together to make space things happen. There is no other domain I've been working in my life where the international cooperation is so important. And I think when we work together, we achieve great things. And even today, when we have all the issues, we can see geopolitically speaking, in the International Space Station, you still have Russian and American working together. And I think the power of space is the only domain where you can see that. I like doing space things because of the benefit it brings on Earth. Audrey described that very well. We use space every day, and sometimes we used to do games at the European Space Agency, where I started my career, or the Australian Space Agency. What a day without space would look like. When you think about it hard, you realize that a lot of things would not work at all. The financial markets, the airplanes, the train station, a lot of things would just be to a handstill. So we use space every day, and the tech to make things happen interests me a lot. But also I'm curious about where we come from as well. The discovery you're doing by studying space is very important to me. I arrived in Australia 26 years ago. Like a lot of foreigners, you come to Australia for a year and you never leave. Fell in love with the country. It's a beautiful place here. And I think you noticed that yesterday walking around Sydney, which is a beautiful place. The only thing that I found when I arrived was like, why there is no space agency in Australia? So people like Melissa and I and others, we try to lobby for having a space agency. So when it was created in 2017, we're very happy. I think we did lots of good things. And today I'm running my own company, and I'm advising industry and government in Australia, but all around the world, around space strategy, space technology, execution of programs, or anything that is related to space, because space touches absolutely everything. There is not a job that exists on Earth that doesn't have a direct implication into space.
Thank you so much. Actually, my first visit to Australia was for the IAC in 2017, and now I live here. So let's start off with the historical perspective. Space has always been political and always been militarized to some extent. Could you talk about how space threats have evolved since the Cold War space race?
You want me to start?
Yeah,
or-
maybe start
Okay.
with you, Audrey.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you look at the history of the US space program, it was really a product of the Cold War exclusively. I mean, it was an opportunity, certainly for the US to demonstrate technical prowess, but really it was all about being able to spy on Soviet ICBM developments, intercontinental ballistic missiles. I mean, that was the entire purpose. So from the very beginning in the US, space has been for national security purposes. And so to your, in the question, right, space has always been militarized. I think it really always has been, because the core foundation of why the US at least went to space in the first place was really for national security purposes. But back in those early days, it was very much a strategic domain. So we were in space to spy, essentially, right? We're looking at the ground-based missiles to spy on these very high-end strategic threats. And so it was understood during the Cold War that if a satellite was attacked, it was likely a precursor to like a nuclear war, because why would you want to attack a satellite if not to blind our understanding of your nuclear forces? That has changed completely in the last 30 years. Space is now really an operational domain. It's not just for sort of strategic spying or strategic early warning. It is embedded kind of in every aspect of military activities. And so when you think about the evolution in the uses of space, now you also have to think about the evolution of what the implications are of a threat. It's no longer, if you get attacked in space, like it's a prelude to nuclear war. No, it's just like kind of a normal part of warfare, actually. Because if your satellites are intricately tied to your forces on the ground, whether they're the ships, the aircraft, or the troops, all that an attack on space assets means is that you're trying to blunt the effectiveness of those other elements of your military force structure. So really it's evolved sort of from a very strategic domain into one that's just like any other part of modern warfare.
Melissa, I might ask you to comment a bit on Australia's evolution around space and space security.
So one of the important consequences of space always being a military domain is the way in which the international, regulatory framework has evolved. So there's a lot of discussion I see, where people say, oh, well, the Outer Space Treaty is old now, so it shouldn't apply. And it doesn't work that way. Law doesn't expire due to the effluxion of time. You have to actually change it. But in fact, over all the time I've been working in space law, I've come to be a real fan of the Outer Space Treaty, because in fact, what it has done, it has prevented conflict in space for over 50 years. So if you talk about something being successful, that is a success, because essentially it was really an agreement between the USSR, as it then was, and the US saying, well, I don't want you doing that thing that, and you don't want me doing that thing either. So let's just agree that we won't do that. So we won't put a weapon of mass destruction in space. Really great idea, because it's not targetable and it wreaks havoc for everyone, indiscriminately. So just to sort of talk about why that international legal framework really, people wrangle about, well, is space a military domain? Will there be war in space? Doesn't the Outer Space Treaty say only for peaceful purposes? Well, yes, it does, but look at the context within which that was formulated and what that really means. So in terms of Australia's strategic position, and we've spent like half of today or nearly all of today, I think, talking about Australia's strategic position in terms of its participation, for example, in AUKUS, in the Quad. But what role do we really play? Well, we are and have been since the dawn of the space age. Australia has been part of that. As a proud South Australian, of course, I always talk about WUMA at every opportunity I get, where we launched Australia's own domestically built satellite. So yes, that has happened, and we were the fourth nation in the world to launch its own domestic satellite from its own territory. Haven't really done it since, but really what that was, what we were part of as Ord very fondly talked about today, the European Launch Development Organization. So we were part of developing space technology. We launched RESAT on a Redstone rocket that the US didn't want and was happy for us to use. So we've been part of a lot of provision of ground services, Earth observation. So we're particularly known, of course, for our geography, because from where we are, we can see at least a third of what's happening in the sky. So we have this particular connection both through our alliance to the US, through history to the US and to the UK, and to a certain extent to Europe. But we are now shifting that focus to working with countries like Japan, who are very keen and very active in space, to Korea, to India. There's been a lot of interest from India in investment and partnership with space technology. So where we sort of sit in, where space drives us in a sort of geopolitical strategic context is really at a place, I think, of shifting and changing. And for us, you know, to work out as a nation where we want to position ourselves with that. But, you know, particularly with our investment in defence, you know, decisions were made that we were going to really just be part of existing sort of US, UK infrastructure rather than kind of go it alone after, you know, a lot of discussion around sovereign capability, but maybe not quite there yet.
Can I add a few things about the space race? So yes, we went on the moon because it was a space race. The Russian did put the first satellite in orbit in 1957, and then Yuri Gagarin was the first man in space. So the Western world had to catch up. I think there is still a bit of a space race happening on the moon. And when we wonder, are we going to go to the moon or Mars and skip the moon and go to Mars? I don't think it's not going to land very well with the Western world if China is the first country to put a human on the moon. So I think the space race is still there. It was a big thing when India landed, was the first lander on the South Pole of the moon. They were the first country to do that. So geopolitically speaking, there is still a race on the moon as far as I'm concerned. To your question of militarization, I've been working in the space business for 30 years. Space is dual use, so there is always a militarization side of space. When you look at the rocket, it's just a big missile. It's coming from there. There is no two way around it. But for me, it was really interesting to see from 2019, there was a US Space Force created there, and then Space Command here in Australia. Same in France, same in China, and same in India. So it was the first time that really space was nominated really clearly as a war domain. And that was a big thing. Land, sea, air, and now space is really recognized as a war domain. And we see more and more activities happening there. You've heard about GPS jamming and spoofing. So making sure that you can't receive the GPS position or making you believe that you're somewhere that you are not supposed to be. So that's the spoofing. We have laser as well, some big laser capability on the ground that can blind your Earth observation satellites. You have communication links that are also affected. So we are seeing more and more things happening in space. And to your comment, Audrey, as well, I completely agree that, and we have seen this, observing the movement of satellite in space gives you an idea of what's going to happen on the ground 2 months later. And there was a conference I attended to in Japan a couple of months ago, and they showed some movement of Russian satellite and Chinese satellite, and then what happened on Earth afterward, and it was just, I just couldn't believe it. It's Star Wars. It has started.
So as I think all of you have alluded to, alliances are quite important in space, and Australia does rely on its allies for space-based data. But maybe if we could talk a little bit, and Audrey, I might start with you, about how space works in alliances, especially because you've got deep experience in government and space.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't think space needs to be any different when it comes to alliances. I mean, an alliance is a strategic a relationship between two nations about how they will come to mutual aid with one another and how they will cooperate, you know, across military and other strategic areas. Like, space is just one element, right? Like I think it's like it's not like we have a alliance for space with this country, an alliance for, you know, air power with another country. We have an alliance. The United States has an alliance with Australia, and how we choose to operationalize that alliance, which particular components of the military we choose to cooperate on, I mean, it's sort of up to us. And, you know, space historically has not been something that's been deeply part of our alliances. And that's honestly mostly the fault of the US. We, because of the strategic roots of the space program and the linkage to the nuclear program, space has always been very classified in the US. And so it's been very difficult, even with our Five Eyes partners, to work on space projects. But we are trying very hard to break down those barriers, because we recognize not only that we can't go it alone anymore in space, but that our allies also have capability to bring to bear. And so, you know, I don't think it's that we need a space alliance, right? We have an alliance. How do we bring space into that alliance?
But sometimes space helps you finding this alliance.
Sure.
And we were talking about this together today. When the nuclear submarine with France didn't go too well, we were trying to mend that relationship, and space was a way to look into this. And we were looking at space situational awareness, how we could do things together. So sometimes space can be the trigger to do an alliance. So, or maybe I'm just obsessed by space. But I've seen some example where it has helped.
So we know when we talk about national security, infrastructure is a really important part of that. So let's talk a little bit about critical space infrastructure. What is it? Why is it important? How do we protect it?
Does someone else want to go first, or do you want me to go first every time?
Do you
No.
go? I think Gord and I are happy for you to go, aren't we? Or do you want to take it?
No,
Oh, it's
let's
ready.
go.
Oh, it's ready to go.
It's like,
Okay, all right.
When I was in the space agency, we wanted to have space as a critical infrastructure because it is a critical infrastructure. As I said, if you live a day without space, not a lot of things are going to work. So we really wanted to have space as a critical infrastructure to give it the importance it deserves, but also to identify the critical infrastructure in space that we have, because we have 2 NBN satellites, which are beautiful birds with lots of KA capacity. They are technologically speaking very good assets. The way to resell is maybe the issue where a lot of people complain, but they are very good assets. We have a lot of orbital slot, this parking place that you have to have in space where you want to put satellites. Some of them are given into priority to Australia. This space, especially in geostationary orbit, are limited. So their value is immense. So we need to protect that as well. Optus has 6 satellites as well in space, and they have a mission control in Australia. So we have quite a bit of infrastructure to protect. So we've been really pushing for that to be part of the SOCI Act. That Melissa, you will probably be the best to talk about it. The other consideration we had is when you're part of a government program, like, okay, you are now part of a critical infrastructure program, there is a lot of things you need to do to be always on top of it, and you have all the tick and the certification and all that. And sometimes we're thinking, are we ready to comply for all this with all these requirements or not? So today, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Melissa, but today I think all the space services of Australia are recognized as a critical infrastructure, but the space asset that actually deliver this service are not. So we're into this middle ground just now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, in the US, it's interesting. We've been having a very similar debate about whether or not space is considered critical infrastructure. And in the US, I mean, probably the same law that you're referring to, or a similar one for the US. We have, I mean, if you're designated as a critical infrastructure sector, it means that the government pays special attention and provides some resources in order to make sure that your systems are essentially hardened against threats because of the criticality of that infrastructure to, you know, everyday life in the country. And so I have a view, and I might disagree with Aude just a little bit, like space is a place, right? Like the things we do in space might be critical. So certain satellites might be critical, but all of space itself, I mean, we can't call that critical infrastructure. It's literally just a place. That'd be like saying, oh, the entire United States is critical infrastructure. No, we designate certain sectors like the telecommunications sector or the oil and gas sector or our defense industrial base as a sector. So I do think there are aspects of our space economy that ought to be designated as critical infrastructure. And probably the best example is our GPS system because of how fundamental it is to just the functioning of not just our society, but every society. But I'd be really hard pressed to say that every satellite that goes into space is somehow critical to the functioning of our everyday lives. I mean, some of the stuff that we do in space is really cool, but that doesn't mean like if it went away tomorrow, like my life would be affected or your life would be affected. And so I think we need to think really hard about what exactly we designate as critical infrastructure, because otherwise you risk sort of diluting the whole thing, and then you're putting resources towards things that may or may not actually be like that important.
So not all threats to space security are from hostile or foreign actors. Some of those threats are just by the nature of the environment, what orbits are used, how crowded that orbit is. So before we move on to talk about maybe some of the more kinetic threats, let's talk about how we manage those, managing traffic in space or managing orbits. Melissa?
Well, also space weather, right?
Yes,
is the
space
other
weather.
thing. So there's natural threats, but yeah. So every time I hear both of you speak, I have many more thoughts. So I always have to process what you've just said before I can address the question. So yes, but I'm thinking you have so many more assets than we do. That's why, each and every one of them is not exquisite, but we'd like to have some too. But anyway, that's just pure envy. So how do we manage traffic? So this gets back to, I think for a long time, we have thought of space as being far away and other and, very difficult to get to. And so we now have to realize that, space is not infinite, and as Ord said, there's particular orbits that are more useful, more valuable for certain things, for communication, for providing mobile internet, you name it. So different orbits are getting more and more congested. So what are we going to do about that? And we also know that under international space law, no state may appropriate a particular area. So the closest we get to it is in, geosynchronous orbit, where because of the way in which it operates, that it appears that the satellite is permanently located above about 1/3 of the equator. So great for big, exquisite communication satellites. So the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, actually allocates slots. And again, there was an issue when it was discussed by the equatorial states who said, well, hang on a minute, these slots are above the equator. We should have more say over who uses these slots rather than everyone else. So it was all sorted out. The ITU has put in a system where you are licensed to use them for a particular period of time. You must occupy that slot within a particular time in order to maintain it. So that's an exquisite kind of area. But as technology gets better, in fact, you can stack up more satellites in that. Now congestion is in LEO, where you have proliferated constellations of satellites, tens of thousands, a lot of discussion among states about the possibility of collision. They're operating around about in the same zone as the crewed space station, both the ISS and the China space station. So there's a great area for grey zone conflict if ever there was one. But in fact, and I was just reading this the other day, even though we focus very much on the constellation satellites, the biggest risk of collision still comes from uncontrollable defunct rockets or basically debris or rocket bodies. So we have particularly at a particular orbital zone, Russian rocket bodies are the ones that are causing a lot of problems. So how do we manage this? It gets us back to, has to be done on an international level. And we just so happen to be at a time when geopolitics is making it extremely difficult for us to get everybody around the table. But who's been sort of managing space situational awareness or space domain awareness up until now, it has been the US Air Force, US Space Force. So the world has really been reliant upon, again, on the US to provide, you know, collision warnings and those sorts of things. So again, we've got that kind of like the fact that you can't take the military space out of the civilian space. It's inherently there. And we still haven't solved that conundrum yet. It's still them who maintain a significant body of knowledge there.
Yeah, well, and actually to add on that, I mean, so the history in the US of what we call space traffic management, right, which you can think about as like air traffic control, but for space, really began in 2009 when there was a catastrophic collision between a US commercial satellite and a Russian defunct satellite. And the two, you know, it's interesting, they weren't necessarily on a collision course with each other. Actually, one of them moved and didn't know that by moving, they were going to essentially put themselves on a collision course with the other. And so these two satellites collided. It was in 2009, and it overnight created like 20% more space debris in low Earth orbit, just this single event. And that was really a wake-up call in the US to say, hey, we've actually got to do something about this. And so as Melissa mentioned, you know, in the US, there was nobody who had the capacity to do that except the military, because the history actually is that the same kinds of radars and other sensors that we use to track missiles can also be used to track satellites. And so this system of tracking satellites and like projecting where they're going to be and warning of potential collisions was really entirely built on the back of an existing US Air Force at the time, set of infrastructure. And so almost by default, the US military kind of became almost like the space traffic manager of the world. But the military, first of all, that's really not what they're there to do, right? And it's really just it's a distraction kind of from their core military function. And so in the last 5 or so years in the US, we've been trying to essentially stand up a civilian version of this space traffic management type capability, which would, instead of being reliant on the military infrastructure, would buy, you know, data and services from the private sector and use that to essentially run a national space traffic management system. The company that I work for in the US is one of those companies where we have a network of telescopes and we track objects in space and we do that kind of analysis. So we are like on the path to have that in the US, but as Melissa mentioned, right, it's not enough to just have one country, unless the whole world wants to be relying on the US, but I don't think that's going to fly geopolitically in every corner of the world. So really the challenge is, certainly there's a domestic challenge for us and for any country to create that national system. But then there's this international challenge of like, how do all those systems talk to each other, right? What data do we share? What are the protocols for sharing that data? What are the thresholds for if two objects are going to, you know, what risk tolerance are we going to allow, right? Because you don't know for sure whether two things are going to collide. Like your understanding where things are is imperfect. So what are those thresholds that we're going to use to suggest that, you know, an operator move, for example? So anyway, so there's a lot of like international policy questions that also need to be resolved in addition to this like domestic capacity question of like, how do we participate in a broader system?
To your question, how do we manage things in space? I don't think we manage.
Right.
I think we monitor at best,
Yeah.
but I don't think we manage. I invite you to look at YouTube. There is a video of the number of objects around the Earth starting in 1956, nothing at all. And then 1957, one Sputnik, a couple of months after, another Sputnik. And then you accelerate to now, there is like 50,000 objects in space that are bigger than 10 centimeters. Hundreds and millions of objects that are less than a centimeter, and even a flake of paint, I always get that wrong. Even a flake of paint going to 7 kilometers a second can destroy your satellites. So it's busy out there. And even when you track and you see a collision, if it's two assets that have no propulsion, you can't do anything about it, just pray, and hopefully they won't collide. That's the only thing you can do. If one has a propulsion capability and the other one has not, okay, Is he a friend? Can I talk to him? Where is the hotline? Where is the number I can call? Doesn't exist. Is he going to move? Because if you move, you're burning fuel. And if you burn fuel, you reduce the life of your assets and your business model is affected. When I was working at the NBN, and it's always at 3 o'clock in the morning that you get a call, you wake up, say, oh, there is a risk of collision. You need to move your spacecraft. Okay, let me make a coffee first. And then, okay, where should I move? Oh, if you move that way, the probability reduced by that. And that way I said, okay, I'm not going to move because, you know, it's assets that you've paid for, taxpayer money. So you have to be very careful in the decision you are making. And these satellites are in GEO. I hear Starlink was what, 7,000 satellites now in space? Every week they do 500 collision maneuver to avoid, avoidance maneuver to avoid to collect between each other. I'm even talking about the other one, between each other. So this is a massive, huge problem. And hopefully we're gonna have a federation of system where we can all play. And as you both said, Australia is looking at the southern sky. So we have a lot of power to contribution to make because of our location where telescope on the ground can be. But also we have a few companies who are doing space-based asset telescope to look at other satellites that are doing some interesting things. So I think that's the main contribution we could make to this problem and try to find solution. You said space weather is important because when you look at these satellites, the space weather is about how the atmosphere is going to be reacting because of the activity of the sun. And depending on that, your satellite is going to reduce its speed and decrease altitude more rapidly. So it's very important to understand what is the space weather looking like so you can predict the orbit of your satellite. So it's a very complex problem. If you love math, do space situational awareness, there's plenty of that. And there's a lot of things to do. Problem is who is going to pay for it and who is going to support this initiative.
Thank you. So one last question for the panel before we open it up to some questions for the audience. I think we can't have any panel on space security without talking about anti-satellite tests or ASATs. You may have seen these in the news, but I might ask, maybe Audrey, I might pick on you to start and talk a little bit about ASATs, their impact, their role.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, look, if you're going to use space for military purposes, and if space is going to be an integral component of how your economy functions, then it's natural that someone might want to attack those satellites if they are trying to blunt your power or, you know, I mean, look, war is politics through other means, right? So I think that to the extent that you're relying on space for military functions, you have to be prepared for threats against those same satellites. And so anti-satellite weapons are kind of like the next natural evolution of the idea of using space for national security purposes. But I would say not all ways of attacking satellites are created equal, okay? And so the one that Kat mentioned, which is what gets a lot of news, is the idea of essentially launching a missile straight up and hitting a satellite and basically blowing it up and creating millions of pieces of debris. That is a bad day for space if something like that happens. And so, and I'll just contrast that with other methods of attacking satellites. So think jamming, right? Or using a laser to blind a satellite, or even a cyber attack against a satellite. You know, there are a lot of different ways you could conceive of to essentially attack a satellite that don't involve blowing it up and creating thousands of pieces of debris. And so actually one of the initiatives I was very proud to work on when I was still in government was the last administration voluntarily said, we will not conduct any debris generating anti-satellite missile tests because we know that it's bad for the space environment and is destabilizing. And we led an international initiative to really get many countries to make similar unilateral commitments not to conduct those types of tests. And actually we ran a resolution at the United Nations really encouraging more and more states to make those kinds of commitments. And so I think, I mean, the US has tried, you know, even to the extent that, yes, we use space for military purposes. Yes, we were thinking about all these threats. Yes, we were thinking about the weaponization of space and all these things. We're also trying to lead in the responsible use of outer space because we realize that if we, you know, muck it up with a bunch of debris, it really doesn't serve our long-term interests, and it certainly doesn't serve the long-term interests of the entire global community that really depends on space and space-based services.
Was there on? I think the other thing that the US has done that's important in this area is there's regulation about requirements for deorbiting once the satellite has reached the end of its useful life. Because as Melissa mentioned, you know, a lot of this debris that's concerning is Russian rocket bodies. So there are ways to lead that the US can lead in that area.
And I should say Australia is also a member of that declaration not to use direct ASAT tests.
So just to add a spin to this, we are starting to see that every time a satellite re-entry in atmosphere and burn in atmosphere, they're created aluminum oxides, and we're starting to create the ozone effect that we are trying to fix, and we are now seeing some issue with that. Imagine if we change the atmospheric composition, all the radio frequency communication will be affected, and no one is taking care of that just yet. We don't have in situ measurement. I think that's the next thing to be done, but we may very quickly find out that this is not the solution, because when I think even of the International Space Station, that's in the size of it, that's going to have to be cut into pieces and burned back in through the atmosphere. What kind of effects that's going to have to that's going to have? So I think the solution have to be found, and sometimes there are people working into this. How can we use? It costs a lot of money to put stuff in space, so can we recycle? Where is the circular economy around this, around the Earth? Can we grab all these satellites and recycle them in orbit? There are some people working on that, but again, they need some government funding and some government incentive to do this. But for me, that is the solution. And the same is already happening in the moon. There is 6 or 7 satellites around the moon, and we already have collision alerts of these 6 and 7 satellites around the moon. So where are we going?
Well, thank you so much. And so now we do have 2 microphones that'll be floating around. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and just maybe wait until the microphone. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. It's interesting and interesting match, all female, and my name Dimitar means God Mother. So we're going to have on the same wavelength, and we are going to I'm holistic data specialist, but I'm going to talk about cleanliness. So no need for envy, Melissa, because we have much cleaner space than the US, and it's been cleaner throughout the 65 to 80,000 years the humans have been living here. I just want to challenge some of these intentions about competition, racing, and all this stuff. The purpose, what's the point? Like, what are we doing? Because that's what the philosophers do, ask questions. So just to very, very quick, sorry, I'm trying to sort of bring the framework. So from 237 years ago, social harmony, we brought the people here to slavery, one aspect. Then from currently we are in techno-feudalism, where the feudalists like Facebook, Apple, whatever are controlling us. And now also in terms of food, from clean food, we are here into, all types of processed, genetically modified, from clean water to Coca-Cola junk, and from reason to propaganda. So now we are in the air, space, SpaceX pollution. So we are still relatively clean, other than the American spies. Where do we go? The question is, why do we need this race? And the last thing that I saw, a couple of the nights, Jack Ma was talking to Elon Musk. Elon Musk was acting like a child in the room. He said, Jack said, why are you so excited about Mars? I just came back and nothing interesting there. I try to solve human problems rather than making them. That's my comment. All right, that's the question.
Sorry.
So maybe to just to bring that together, I think the question is around why are we in space and what's the importance of it?
Well, can I jump in on this one? Because I'm passionate about this. I'm absolutely passionate about humans going to space because it's something I think that not everybody, but for some people, you know, it is our destiny to explore, right? And I think the things that we learn when we're in space and the opportunities that we have to collaborate when we are in space make us better humans than we were before. So I think, for example, the International Space Station is a magnificent example of collaboration and harmony and all of those things, but also a place where incredibly wonderful science is being done. So life-saving medical science is being done in the low gravity environment of the International Space Station. So I think what we're talking about tonight is like the political realities of rivalry and conflict, but we're also talking about how those things can be overcome by alliances, by science, by good governance, and looking forward to things like the moon, where China is going to lead a project, America is going to lead Artemis. And, you know, when we go on to Mars, the opportunity will be to look for things like origin of life on Mars, which I find tremendously exciting. And I think my children and their children will also find it tremendously exciting.
Very quick question, sorry. Why the sun is politicized? Like, why is not China there? China is also going to the moon, and there are opportunities for us to collaborate with China. That's a big project that I'm working on as an academic, that Chinese academics are working on, that lots of Americans are working on. So it is a possibility that might happen. Yeah.
And same thing. When I was in the agency, I was working a lot with the Chinese Space Agency, so the science cooperation there. Just to add to what you said, there is a lot of spin back from everything we do in space. In the International Space Station, you need to recycle water, you need to be careful with the energy. So there is a lot of things. Every year, NASA published like two volumes of IP, of new tech that has been invented because we are forced to be sustainable in space. And we don't talk enough about that spin back that everything we do in space brings. So I think that's something that we need to communicate a bit more about.
Fantastic. Another question up here. I think we'll go for this side.
Thank you very much. With all of the launching of rockets into space, what impact is that having in terms of global warming, which is also a major issue for us?
I'm happy to start with this one. Not worse than, I'm not saying it's clean, not worse than all the planes that are taking off in an hour on Sydney airports. So we should maybe look into that first. There is a lot of effort being done into green fuel. So we're looking into methane, we're looking into propane. So there are efforts being done in there. But you're right, this is a concern, and this is a concern a lot of people are working on. It's called like the green fuel propulsion for space rockets.
Hi. What can we do about private alliances? I mean, you talked about countries and how can we get the countries together, but majority of space, I think, has become more of a private entity right now with satellites on different people, different companies. So what can we do about private alliances and how can we make them better?
Well, I mean, so one of the things that Melissa alluded to is the international legal regime that governs space activities. And one of the key aspects of this outer space treaty is that it makes governments responsible for the space activities of their national actors or that are being conducted on their soil. So at the international level, between states, there's really no distinction between whether it's government or private sector, because those governments have to be responsible for their companies. And so, you know, at the end of the day, this is where the government role really does matter in terms of stepping up, providing, you know, a regulatory regime for those companies, and frankly, putting, you know, domestic rules in place about how they will behave when they are operating in space. And, you know, one of the things I worry about when I look at the future of space is that we will end up with a system like we have kind of at sea, where you have flags of convenience. You know, that some governments, you know, they want to attract the investment of space, but without doing that like necessary supervision that's required. And so they'd have, like no regulatory structure or very lax regulatory structure. And that, then countries will choose to headquarter themselves there and do their operations there because it's just easier. But that doesn't make the whole international system like work. And so I think the responsible thing that government's done, and I know the US has done, I'm pretty sure Australia has done, is created a very robust set of regulations to really, both manage that private sector, but also to enable them to succeed.
Thank you. Really great conversation. That's really interesting. Have any of the DOGE cuts in the United States had an impact on anything in the space realm yet, as they have at NOAA or any of those other organizations that have been axed, with the exception of a Starlink program?
Yeah. So look, DOGE is real, and new things happen every day. Yeah, you really have to follow the headlines. So the answer to your question is like yes, but no, or yes, but not yet is probably the better way to say it. So in the first few months of the administration, many things happened, but there were no direct cuts to the space program thus far. Now, just a few weeks ago, the Trump administration released its budget proposal for the fiscal year that for us starts in October. And that proposal made some significant cuts to both NASA programs as well as NOAA, which is our National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, so weather, satellites, and other things. They do lots of things. And if those cuts were to be enacted, it would be a very significant impact to the US space industry, both in terms of changing kind of the direction, but also just frankly reducing the amount of resources that go to it. Now, our Congress gets a vote, right? The president makes a proposal for the budget, but our Congress is actually the one that holds the power of the purse and appropriates funding. So I think this is where the sort of yes, but not yet part of the answer comes in. I think it still remains to be seen whether Congress will actually go along with what the administration has proposed and actually follow through with these kinds of cuts. I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't tell you how it's going to end.
I think we had a question up here, and then probably might be the last question in the back. So.
Hi, and thank you for your talk. Anyway, so this might seem like a naive question. It's just been oscillating through my mind. But when I was a child, much like my former partner went to the space industry, he remained a pacifist and didn't like the military, didn't like any of that. And you came straight on. It's like atomic bomb. We're going to, the Cold War. And I am very much in reality, at that time, more of the hawk. I'm like, they wouldn't have funded any of this without the Cold War. None of the money would have come in. Space gets propelled by war. So two things occur to me as this talk has gone. I don't know what's happening behind the scenes, but I assume to some level anyway, China is going to want some sort of leverage over the US is going to want leverage over China, and that may provide funds. And the other question that I have, which someone local, well, actually there are two more questions. Second question I have is that, will that then affect Australia, space industry, and what does that look like in the future, immediate future? And then finally, when I read the Outer Space Treaty, the professor of law, it sounded very optimistic about once we go past, there'll be no militarization, there'll be security forces maybe, but it was all in peace. That's how I read it. And I was on the face of reading it. So those are my three questions. There's this sort of civilian, peace is lovely, it's going to be great. It's yeah, but every time anything happens in humanity, there's always some sort of force of regulation in my head. And then the next question is that sort of scientific, Star Trek view of the world, I guess.
So maybe I'll start and then, I just think space is not special. And I say that as also a fellow space nerd up here, right? It's not special. And guess what? Humans, they go to war with each other. They have conflict, there's competition, and I really don't think space is any different. And So to your kind of part two of that question about China and competition, I think to the extent that the US and China are in competition with one another, or even looking historically at the race, or not the race, the Cold War between the US and Soviet Union, I mean, space is going to be a part of that, like any other facet of our economic might or our economic power or our military might. And so I actually just think of space as just any other piece of that broader kind of geopolitical and security dimension that exists across every aspect of humanity.
Just one comment about space is not special. Because landing on the moon is hard. There is nothing
Yes.
harder than that. So whoever managed it has a big tech superiority that you can't have anywhere else. So space is special.
So I have a bit of a show bag of answers to your question, because it was a bit of a show bag of questions to start off with. So what I want to say about China is we should be really interested in what China is doing on the moon, right? They have achieved amazing things. They have landed on the far side of the moon. They have brought back regolith samples from the far side of the moon. They are doing exceptional things. Amazing science, amazing robotic science. They will be landing on the south pole of the moon sooner rather than later. Doesn't that provide us with an exceptional opportunity to say, for example, we need to work out your alliance and our alliance, how we're going to cooperate there? So I think, yes, we do need to be alert to what other states are doing, but they have every right to do them in the same way that we do, for the same reasons that many of us do them, which is like scientific knowledge, but also state pride. So again, if you think about, you've read the Outer Space Treaty, which describes astronauts as the envoys of humankind. What does that even mean? It certainly doesn't mean that they're a diplomat that's able to represent the Earth to the rest of the solar system, I'm pretty sure. But it means something. So we regard people, humans who have been to space, as somehow being important. So space does carry with it that sort of sense of achievement. You've done something that's supremely difficult. So we're going to have to keep managing these strategic relationships. And the final question was about the optimism of the Outer Space Treaty. Yeah, well, as I say, I always think it helps if we view the Outer Space Treaty as an arms control treaty. It was very much done in the context of the Cold War, but it has kept peace in space for over 50 years. So I would say, in fact, it has been a very successful treaty, and it obliges us to continue to work within its confines, even though they were essentially a compromise between the two nuclear powers of the day. But, again, because something is derived from military technology does not inherently mean that it is bad. Remember where the internet was developed and how it developed and what funding led to the development of the internet. And I'm not saying the internet is good, right? But it has its uses. And, so defense, military spending, scientific superiority. If you're interested, you should read the book by Neil deGrasse Tyson, which talks about, it's called, I think, Accessory to War, and it talks about the relationship between space science and military funding. Yeah.
So I think if you have a very quick question, we have time for that. Okay, so it might have been answered.
I think there was one. There's
Yeah.
one, yeah. Is it quick?
You mentioned the relationship with governments being in control of and collaborating on systems and that sort of thing. I think the news that came out early in the Ukrainian war about Elon Musk turning off his communications to prevent this and that and the other was the first time sort of a private, a head of a private company, sorry, this question's getting longer, and that private corporation, I mean, it was a leap forward technologically, but at the same time, it seems like it's getting a little out of hand in terms of the government being able to control some of the private companies, although I'm sure they're tightly integrated, but, we don't hear about, we just hear Elon turned off his satellites and that was that kind of thing. So, you know, there's a lot of it behind the curtain that we don't really know about.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a really great point, and certainly something that got a lot of attention in the US. And, you know, the arrangement with the Ukrainians using Starlink was kind of a unique one in that, like, there wasn't like a contract in place that had like terms and conditions. Like Elon kind of just like volunteered, like at the beginning of the war, like take some Starlink terminals and use them. And that kind of sort of lack of the clear terms, I think, is what allowed him to do what he did. Now, that being said, you're absolutely right. This is sort of a private citizen, you know, owner of a company, you know, having an impact on geopolitics. And while I agree that it is the first time we've seen that in space, just think about other industries. I mean, it's not completely a foreign concept. I mean, think about oil in terms of OPEC having control over the economy when they decide to cut production or raise production in order to raise gas prices. I mean, this is something we see very acutely, like in the US. So I just would say that, yes, I mean, it is something we should be concerned about and we do need to think carefully about in space, but I just don't think it's an entirely new phenomenon if you just think broadly about the impact of some commercial industries on geopolitics.
And can I just finish off on that one? Because he got a terrible fright, or people at his company got a terrible fright when they realized that that then made them targetable under international humanitarian law. So that then led to a change of the whole corporate structure of how Starlink might provide services to defense. So yeah, it was a wake-up moment, but it was a wake-up moment for SpaceX Starlink as well.
And if I can add an anecdote on this, and there is a very good article in The Economist explaining that Europe tried to see how they could provide communication services to Ukraine when the Starlink ended up servicing the country. And they said, we can actually cover all your use cases except one. And the one that they couldn't was the drone. The drone needs very low latency communication for obvious reasons. With LEO, you have 40 milliseconds latency, and with the MEO, so middle Earth orbit or GEO, the latency is 100 milliseconds, 400 milliseconds, and that made a big difference for the drone attack. And the Ukraine war is a big drone war. This is the use case that only Starlink could help. So that was very interesting.
So I'll just ask if any of you have any final thoughts to share on space security before we wrap up. And if you don't, that's okay as well, but wanted to get the opportunity.
Well, I mean, I think I've sort of said it all, but I guess the one thing I would just say one more time is, you know, I think space it's so integral to so many facets of our lives that it is important for us to think about how we protect the services that we depend on every day, and not to just, like, I guess, lose sight of the broader fabric in which, you know, space activities are taking place within our societies and our you know, our broader geopolitical relationships.
And I will also say again that if you can live today with the realization of how much space services we all use and need on our daily life for making our country more secure and more safe as well. I mean, for disaster management, space has a very critical application as well. So we need to protect that, and we need to make sure that people understand that, because Australia needs space mission and a space industry.
And I would say that discussions like this are really, really important for space security, because we need to be talking about these things. Australia needs to be talking about it and thinking about, well, how do we position ourselves as a space actor? So Australia is, you know, and I hate this expression, we all hate it, is a middle space power, whatever that means. It means we kind of do space, but not too much, you know. But how do we regard ourselves? And I think, you know, one of the things that the agency has done really well is to position Australia as being a responsible space actor, as a nation that cares deeply about sustainability on Earth and in space. And also, I think the relationship that we have with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and to learn this lesson that space is part of country. Like, it's not out there, divorced away, separated from what we do, but affects us and we affect it. And I think those sorts of ways in which Australia has been able to make some inroads and saying, well, what do we like as a space actor, are really important, but we've got a lot more work that we need to do on that.
And if you're interested in that specific perspective that our First Nations people can offer, I would highly recommend the book Sky Country as a read. It's very fantastic in this. And if you have any other questions about issues in space and the Alliance, or want to learn more about the work we do at the United States Study Center, I encourage you to please visit our website at ussc.edu.au. And then I just want to thank you again so much to our panelists for coming tonight, and thank you for all coming in with such great questions.